Hey everyone, welcome to episode 2. So today I thought we'd spend a little bit of time looking at or considering the problem planning solves. I'd like to do that a little bit by way of explanation of my background. Hopefully, this is helpful to you if you're kind of wondering, well, why in the world I listen to Eric talk about planning. But also, my history is sort of linked to planning and the problem planning solves. So I thought maybe as a way to share my story, but also make a case, not just for my background, but also for planning in general. This episode would focus on that. So if you go back to 2008, a few years ago, I was moving to the Nashville area and leaving my job. I was working for a large, growing actually university in Virginia, and we were going to relocate for family reasons. And so there was a change to my work arrangement. The question was, is would I stay on with the university or would I change jobs? Would I move to a new company in the Nashville area? And as it turned out, when I was considering, I was working for the CIO at the time, and when we were considering what I might do if I was to stay on with the university, um, we talked a lot about this notion that we were having trouble planning. And in part, what was represented there was we were incredibly what we call demand reactive. So the notion, we were growing, and so there was lots of customers that wanted IT services. And as a result, we were not being very intentional. We were just kind of what you call putting out fires. Frequently we called what we did firefighting because it was running from one sort of emergency, one squeaky wheel customer to the next, and frequently motivated at that time by, I hate to say politics, but yeah, role. More senior people frequently had an opportunity to get in our queue higher than other people, and so it was at the time very ad hoc and sort of crisis management. And so the problem we saw in that experience was a lack of intentionality, an inability to sort of meet commitments over a long period, right? So we were able to meet short-term commitments, hopping from disaster to disaster or high priority need to high priority need. But what we were not able to do is say in 6 months we would be here, in 8 months we would be here, in 10 months we would be here. And so this idea of planning being a solution, both of course planning itself, but also the focus to accomplish plans was important to us as an organization. And so the byline fixed planning in IT became my new mission. And so as I moved, stayed on with the university, and they were gracious enough to let me continue my employment, though I relocated. But my new charter, my new task was to fix planning in a growing IT organization. We were, just maybe 2 years earlier, we were around 80 people. And by that point, we had reached about 150 people. And so we were growing rapidly. Um, and so there were new problems. And the reason we were growing is because demands were growing, demands for our services were growing. And so um, we needed to be more intentional. That was a word we used a lot in those days. I would frequently draw sort of an XY axis, kind of carving up 4 quadrants. In the bottom left quadrant was this very demand oriented reactivity, that we were living in, what we call demand reactive. And it was what our operating model turned out to be. It was, and this was of course not by design, but it was by necessity. And then along the other three, the other 3 quadrants was this idea that the further up and to the right we wanted to be, we would hopefully become more strategic, and more proactive rather than demand oriented and reactive. And that wasn't to say we weren't going to be, just to say we were hopefully going to become more strategic, more intentional, more committed to an ability to accomplish things over the long term. And so we would try to get our dot, so to speak, from that bottom left quadrant to the top right quadrant. demand reactive, bottom left, strategic proactive, top right. And so the idea was is how do we be intentional? And so that sent me on about a 2-year journey, because to be honest, where I was in my career, I didn't really know how to solve the problem. Fixing planning in IT was not exactly something notionally I knew how to do. And so I started to read a lot of books and materials and webinars and series and research notes and blog, whatever I could get my hands on to understand how large organizations plan. And then, so to speak, a few themes started to emerge. Of course, quickly, I started to learn that planning and governance were sort of linked, right? Because you can't have a plan, you can draw up a plan, you can make a plan, but if you can't govern the plan, if you can't stay committed to and focused on the plan, and even determine not just is focus the enemy of long-term success, but also certainly performance. Are we doing the things not just that the plan said we should do, but is the plan working? So governance became important. Continuous improvement, notions of themes of continuous improvement became important. And then lastly, enterprise architecture started to emerge a lot, and the reason for that was because the link between sort of the business notion of outcomes and technology, and how we can sort of leverage technology to accomplish those business outcomes in large organizations, especially what we were becoming at the time, often is marshaled through this notion of enterprise architecture. It's carving up all these technical capabilities, talking about them in different domains and spheres, things like technical architecture, infrastructure architecture, data architecture, software or application architecture, and even business architecture, which is the notion of process and business capabilities. And anyway, so all this integrated into an intentionally designed whole is the idea of enterprise architecture. And so that became another theme. And so and of course, so did strategic planning and a variety of other, sort of whole organization, not necessarily even IT specific disciplines. And so, as I said, I read a lot, and we began to practice what I was reading. The very first thing we did, timing was interesting, is we were going through the process of writing our next 3-year strategic plan as just an organization as a whole. And so the very first opportunity I got to write a large plan was participating in the IT portion or creating the IT portion of that strategic plan. I can tell you that first 3-year plan was just awful because it was the first time I'd ever done it. I didn't have all the disciplines I just mentioned sort of down pat, nor had I really explored very many of them. It was early in that 2-year period that I was asked to help create the new IT plan, which is sort of ironic because I didn't not only did I not know what I was doing, but I hadn't got far enough down the path to even have a guess. But it was something, and so we created it and iterated on it and allowed it to be a framework for maybe not just planning, but also learning how to plan. Um, and so that began. So approximately, so that would have been the first 2 years of that tenure, fixing planning. Not a wonderful title associated to what I was doing. I think we made something up, that was loosely related to planning. But then again, as I said, as themes like enterprise architecture started to emerge, I knew notionally that I was going to need to become an enterprise architect, and so I dove deep, right? Read everything I could get from Zachman, everything I could get from, there's several sort of U.S. Department of Defense and federally backed enterprise architecture frameworks, DODAF, FIF. And then I stumbled into what has now become largely the de facto most generalized framework, the Open Groups Architecture Framework, TOGAF is frequently how it's referred, and read that cover to cover, which is approximately 900 to 1,000 pages. So that was the basis of the framework or the theory behind what became my next 7 years of vocation, which was building an enterprise architecture organization, which encompassed a few different spheres. It of course took on IT strategic planning. By the time we left, we had over 600 people in IT, and so again, we continued to grow, and that growth created an interesting set of problems. But the problem that we were solving generally, which of course planning will help you solve, is intentionality. So again, moving that dot from that demand reactive corner to where you're just simply processing transactions in the extremely tactical, near-term, transaction-oriented fashion. Next customer, next customer, next customer, next customer, to a more strategic view of the world. And hopefully through that, achieving some disciplines, like having a documented plan means having an ability to govern according to the plan, having an ability to establish performance management according to the plan. Means hopefully the ability to accomplish longer term goals. So that was the problem we were solving. And ultimately that was what we were able to do. So since then, I have been able to splay out. I worked while at the university. I actually worked through a couple of side ventures, helping organizations build IT plans. So a lot of my multi-organization experience in those days came both daytime and nighttime kind of work. And then more recently, having spent the last 3 years at Provisions Group, I've been able to serve organizations, not just our own growing organization. Provisions Group is proper, has grown into this mini multi-service line IT consulting group in the last 3 years. But also we, as a function of our services in the market, have helped organizations plan and accomplish IT planning as a function. So anyway, that's a little bit of my background, a little bit of my story, but also the problem that planning is seeking to solve, which we will spend each of these daily sort of episodes looking at, is intentionality, focus, and ultimately a framework that allows you to not just have focus, but meaningfully accomplish things within that focus. It's one thing to stare at something, that's focus. It's another thing to know what to do while you're staring at it. So that's the goal of planning, is to give you something productive to do that allows you over the long term to focus. And again, long term is sort of relative. It can be 6 months, it could be 3 months, it could be a month. I mean, honestly, depending on how small your transactions are. If your transactions or the ways you serve your customers are 3-month long projects, then long term is not 3 months. Typically, typically what you're doing in that 3 months, so you don't have to plan for it. You know what you're doing. But if you're serving customers sort of a bagel at a time, or a muffin at a time, these are small transactions, right? So long term for you, maybe a month, because you're doing so many really small things over a short period of time. So the question is, how do you, when your focus is often diverted to the short term? Again, short term is also relative. Could be a couple minutes, could be 3 months, right? But whatever your attention is naturally given to, how do you accomplish the next set of things? Because you've got this train of short terms sort of all stacked up, ready to sort of borrow your focus. And so the question, again, the problem I've solved for companies over the last 15 years is, how do we both accomplish today, but do so in a meaningfully productive way so that it can contribute to whatever long-term goal you have. As I said, long-term could be 3 months, it could be 6 months, it could be 6 years. Frequently, companies are moving at a pace today that 6 years is longer than they are able to strategically plan. But yeah, I mean, sometimes long-term means focusing in the 5 to 7 to sometimes 10 years. Industries that are more stable can plan out 10 years, right? So that's the ability to maintain focus over a 10-year period, so that whatever you intended on accomplishing in a 10-year period, that requires a fair bit of focus, right, and a fair bit of discipline. And so hopefully what we'll talk about, or what we will talk about in the coming episodes, is some tools to plan, and then, as I said, frameworks and techniques. Once the plan has been drawn up and communicated, what are some ways to live and operate and succeed in that plan? So anyway, hopefully that was helpful, and have a wonderful, I guess today's Tuesday. Hey, have a wonderful Tuesday. Thanks, everybody.